Okay. Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we're back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. So, yeah, we're getting into Chapter 3. This is called Monterosa's Mission. See how long this is. I didn't bother looking at its length before we started, but might as well do that now. Okay, it isn't too horrible. Still long enough, but yeah, let's get into this. Okay. Oh, and if you haven't wondered where I've been, my computer decided it was going to die. But yeah, anyway. 4 miles south of El Mozote, outside of the hamlet of La Guatemala, the guerrillas of the People's Revolutionary Army also awaited the soldiers. From their agents in the capital, they knew the large shipments of American munitions had been arriving at Hopango Airport, and the truckloads of troops had begun moving along the Pan American Highway toward Morazan. On December the 1st, Jonas, the most powerful commandant in the zone, had pulled aside Santiago, the director of the ERP's clandestine radio Venceremos, and informed him that an operation of great breadth named Yunque y Martillo, Hammer and Anvil, was being planned. Santiago recalls that the intelligence sources within the army itself had passed on a report of a key meeting at the high command. According to the sources' reconstruction, the Minister of Defense, Colonel Jose Guillermo Garcia, declared to his officers that Operation Rescue must wrest the offensive from the FMLN, the guerrilla umbrella group, of which the ERP was one of the 5 members. His vice minister, Colonel Francisco Adolfo Castillo, added that the troops must advance no matter what the cost until we reach the command post and radio Venceremos. Then Lieutenant Colonel Domingo Monterosa Barrios, the dynamic commander of the Atocadal battalion, broke in, agreeing wholeheartedly that so long as we don't finish off this radio Venceremos, we'll always have a scorpion tip up our ass. Colonel Monterosa, who was at the time the most celebrated field commander in the Salvadoran army, was well known to have an obsession with Radio Venceremos. He was not alone. The station, which specialized in ideological propaganda, acerbic commentary, and pointed ridicule of the government, infuriated most officers, for its every broadcast reminded the world of the army's impotence in much of Morazan. Even worse, the radio managed to be funny. They actually acted out this daytime serial like a soap opera, with Alexander Ambassador Hinton in it. A United States defense attaché of the time recalls they'd called the ambassador this gringo who is marrying a Salvadoran woman. Country's Salvadoran woman, Deanne Hinton, was about to marry a woman from one of the country's wealthy families. Dean Hinton was about to marry a woman from one of the country's wealthy families. And at the end, they'd say, "Tune in again tomorrow," and you couldn't do anything about it. Most people at the embassy, including the ambassador, wanted to hear it. This mortified Salvadoran officers maintained that the broadcast originated in Nicaragua or Honduras. Colonel Monterosa was mortified by Radio Venceremos as well, but unlike his colleagues, he had determined in his rage and frustration to do something about it. For Monterosa, as American military advisors had come to recognize, was a very different kind of Salvadoran officer. By late 1981, with Congress and the American public having shown themselves resolutely opposed to dispatching American combat forces to Central America, it had become quite clear that the only way to prevent another Nicaragua was somehow to reform the Salvadoran army. "We were on our last legs," the American military advisor who was in the country at the time told me. "We had to reform or we were going to lose. And it wasn't because the guerrillas were so good. It was because the army was so bad." Salvadoran troops were sent into the field virtually untrained. Soldiers rarely left the barracks after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and officers rarely left the barracks at all. The institution simply did not support people being good commanders, this advisor said. "I mean, who ever got relieved? You could surrender with 85 men and nothing at all would happen to you." As the Americans soon realized, however, reform meant remaking an officer corps that had developed its own very special criteria for advancement and reward. These had to do not with military competence, but with politics, with showing unstinting loyalty to the institution and above all to one's military academy class, one's tanda, as it was called. 100 teenage boys might enter the Gerardo Barrios Military Academy, and from there number perhaps 20 toughened, hardened men would emerge 4 years later. Throughout the next quarter century, these men would be promoted together, would become rich together, and would gradually gain power together. If among them there proved to be an embarrassing incompetence, not to mention murderers and rapists and thieves, then these men were shielded by their classmates and defended ferociously. Finally, perhaps 2 decades after graduation, 1 or 2 from the Tanda, those who had stood out clearly as presidentiables, as destined to become leaders of the country, would lobby within the officer corps to become the president of El Salvador. Monterosa had graduated in 1963, and though the accords show him fourth in his class of 19, it is a testament to the respect he inspired that many officers now remember him as first. In the academy, he was a magnetic figure, charismatic from the start. Short, with the simple face and large nose of a Salvadoran peasant, he walked with the peasant's long, loping stride, which he made his distinctly non-martial figure recognizable from far off. General Adolfo Blondin, a former chief of staff who was in his last year in the academy when Monterosa was in his first, recalls that the young man established himself immediately as the best in his class, the top rank in his studies, physical conditioning, knowledge of the concepts of war. Normally, of course, such prestige, such respect from his colleagues would brand him presidentiable. But, unlike his fellows, Monterosa was, as Blandon puts it, that rare thing, a pure 100% soldier, a natural leader, a born military man with the rare quality of being able to instill loyalty in his men. In the year after his graduation, Monterosa taught at the academy, took courses from the Americans in Panama, traveled to Taiwan to study anti-communist counterinsurgency tactics, and served in the paratroops as part of El Salvador's first free-fall team. After the controversial elections of 1972, in which a hardline faction of the military stole the ballot from what looked to be a winning Christian Democratic ticket, led by San Salvador's mayor José Napoleón Duarte, Monterosa grew close to the new military president, Colonel Arturo Molina. In the army at this time, the key focus was on politics and the struggle over El Salvador's stunted political development increasingly split the country and the officer corps. By the late 70s, after Molina had given place to General Carlos Humberto Romero in another dubious election, the situation had become even more polarized. On the far left, several tiny guerrilla groups were kidnapping businessmen, robbing banks, and on occasion assassinating prominent rightist leaders. Activists on the moderate left, having been denied an electoral path to the presidential palace by the army's habitual ballot tampering, joined populist forces in organizing vast demonstrations and managed to bring hundreds of thousands of people into the streets. The security forces generally responded to these demonstrations by unflinching violence. Shooting down scores and sometimes hundreds of Salvadorans. Within the Salvadoran officer corps, the country's political crisis had reopened a political fault line that had been spread apart periodically throughout the century. Back in 1960, a faction of progressive officers had staged a coup, but it had been quickly reversed by a conservative counter-coup in 1972, when Duarte's victory was stolen by conservative officers. The progressives attempted another, with the same result. Finally, in October of 1979, with at least tacit American support, a group of young reformists who called themselves the Juventud Militar, the military youth, overthrew General Romero, and in his place a progressive junta which included politicians of the left. As had happened 2 decades before, however, the conservatives in the army almost immediately regained the upper hand, and now, under cover of the more intentionally acceptable reformist government, they felt free to combat the communist agitation in their own particular way by intensifying the dirty war against the left. The most visible signs of the dirty war were mutilated corpses that each morning littered the streets of El Salvador cities. Sometimes the bodies were headless or faceless, their features having been obliterated with a shotgun blast or an application of battery acid. Sometimes limbs were missing, or hands or feet chopped off, or eyes gouged out. Women's genitals were torn and bloody, bespeaking repeated rape. Men's were found severed and stuffed into their mouths, and cut into the flesh of the corpse's back and chest was likely to be a signature of one of or another of the death squads that had done the work, the most notorious of which was the Union of White Warriors and the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez Brigade. The latter was named for a general who had taken over the country in 1931 during a time when the leftist agitation among the peasantry, and had responded the following year with a campaign of repression so ferocious that it came to be known simply as La Matanza. Throughout the western part of the country, where an abortive rebellion had been centered, numbers of the National Guard, along with civilian irregulars, lined peasants up against the wall and shot them. Before the purge was over, they had murdered well over 10,000 people. Some estimates put the number at 4 times that. The reasoning behind the repression was quite simple. Where the infection of rebellion had taken hold, it must be rooted out ruthlessly and thoroughly. And the technique proved extremely effective a half-century later when the infection raged once again in Salvador. Those areas where the killing had been rampant 5 decades before remained remarkably quiescent. Quiescent? Not sure how it was pronounced. But anyway, yeah. That it's showing a bit of the history of El Salvador and the activities that happened. There's always been a bloody conflict going on. You know, one coup after another. And Americans were happy to back whoever would help serve their wants and needs. And of course, this was during the age of the Cold War, so, you know, we didn't want communists in charge. It's ridiculous. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I appreciate you all for watching. See you all in the next video. Until then, Later.